All right. Well, we're streaming. So we'll wait a few seconds just for it to start. Come on then, Paige. Right, well, that looks like us there. And do we have volume?
Good.
Okay, just talking to myself a bit. Right. If you could just say something, Vince, so we can check your audio, maybe greet the people.
Yeah, see if it's got me. Hello, folks. Please leave a comment if you can hear what I'm saying.
If you could just say something, Vince, so we can check your audio, maybe greet the people. Right. Excellent. We have audio and we have video. Hey, hold up. I thought that Okay, well, we don't have technical issues tonight. So, hello, everybody. We are starting our new podcast, which is called It's Elemental. It will be another weekly show, and in this one we will be looking at philosophy and spirituality, ways to be in the world, and having conversations around different attitudes that we can adopt to deal with the things that we've been bringing up in our other shows. And the show, this show, It's Elemental, will consist of me, Bob Dub, Vince, who is with me tonight, and Julian, who can't make it tonight, but that's okay because we are going to do a deep dive into Vince's book, It's Elemental. And I beg your pardon, Elementalism. So Vince, thank you so much for joining me. It's great to be with you again tonight on this new venture.
Cheers, Bob. It's always fun to talk to you. It's going to be fun again tonight. Hello, Internet. Thanks for tuning in.
Awesome. And as Vince, I think, did mention in our sound check, we will be taking your questions. So I see that we have 10 people here with us. So that's really cool. Thank you very, very much for joining us. Right. So as I mentioned really briefly, this is philosophy and spirituality. But Vince, what is your vision for the show? Where do you think we're going to go, and what sort of topics are you going to be wanting to discuss on the stream?
What I want to discuss on the stream, Bob, are the reasons why elementalism needs to exist in the world today, 2023, and talk about the various aspects of it. Elementalism covers a lot of various philosophical questions that people have asked throughout the ages, and it's possible to, in discussing all these aspects, to cover a lot of areas. So I think we can entertain some people by talking about these aspects of spirituality that aren't often discussed, especially not in the mainstream media.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, well, let's not mess around then. Let's just jump straight in. Vince, what is elementalism?
Elementalism is the philosophy or religion of the future. It is the philosophy of the Age of Aquarius, this being the new great age of the world. And every time there's a new great age of the world, there's a new set of religious traditions, all of which are really explorations of the perennial philosophy, the great philosophy that runs throughout all of time, the great religious philosophy of which all true, genuine spiritual traditions are a part of. So elementalism is really just another form of this, but for the 21st century. So it's intended to appeal to people who are just coming out of the age that we've just been in, this age of great nihilism and despair, lasting some 120 years. And it's an effort to answer those philosophical and spiritual questions that common man has today.
So it has a sort of a continuity and a connection to the past, doesn't it? This isn't something that's just sprung up new. This is, as you're saying, these are eternal questions.
this is absolutely not something that has just been made up in recent years. It is another form of the great perennial philosophy that is manifested many times throughout history in a variety of philosophical and spiritual traditions. So really, elementalism traces its inspiration back to Hermes Trismegistus, who was the great Egyptian priest and philosopher and king, who inspired the Kybalion, which many of the listeners to shows like this will have read, and who in turn inspired elementalism. This was indirectly through the Hermetic Renaissance in the 1400s, 1500s, involving men like Giordano Bruno, who is a great inspiration to me, great inspiration to all elementalists, and everybody who wants to see the spiritual truths that are behind what are called the veils of Isis, which is another name for the veils of materialism, which make people think that the physical world is real and the basis of reality. So elementalism is partially about releasing people from these materialist delusions.
Interesting. Okay. So, right. So, what inspired elementalism? What initially inspired back in those days of the priests, the Egyptian priests?
They would have, in my belief, they would have had a philosophy very similar to elementalism. They would have understood the most basic concepts in elementalism. These would have all been well known by the priesthood back in ancient Egypt, just like in ancient Greece and in ancient Rome and several other places. But what inspired elementalism relates to Friedrich Nietzsche's idea that if we don't fill the gap left by the death of the Abrahamic God, then we're going to involve ourselves in some horrific examples of nihilism. Nietzsche predicted, in my opinion, he predicted World War I, World War II. He predicted that if we lost touch with the spiritual world and pretended that it didn't exist anymore and just pretended to move on and become materialists, then we would also end up becoming atheists and nihilists, and that could have the potential for things like World War I, catastrophic mass killing and warfare. So he understood that there was a need for another philosophy to rise, another spiritual or religious philosophy to rise up, and to fill that gap that was left by the death of Yahweh, and give people a reason to hope again, give people a reason to believe once more in something beyond the material.
Mm. So how did you come across this idea of elementalism? How did it become real to you?
It became real to me through studying Plato and books like Timaeus, where he talks about the ancient Indo-European beliefs regarding philosophical and spiritual concepts like reincarnation and karma. In Timaeus, and this was written 2,300 years ago, Plato writes about reincarnation, and he writes about that if people behave in a certain manner, they will reincarnate as animals who personify that particular manner. So if you behave slothfully, you'll be reborn as a sloth. If you're lustful, you're reborn as a dog. If you're gluttonous, you're reborn as a pig, and so on. So he believed in reincarnation and karma, and this used to be the belief of most Indo-European peoples before the Abrahamic invasions. So elementalism is, in a sense, hearkening back to the natural spiritual beliefs that used to exist before the demon god Yahweh started meddling with the world.
Okay, so we've talked before on previous podcasts that we've done of your extreme anxiety around death. Was this being reborn as animals part of that anxiety that you had, or was that a separate thing?
Not since taking magic mushrooms on Boxing Day 2008 and having a massively powerful and transformative psychedelic experience have I had any fear of death. The fear of death, in my understanding of things, relates particularly to materialism, and particularly to the idea that if you are your physical body, then you're going to be extinguished upon the death of that physical body. most materialists believe that the brain somehow magically generates consciousness, and part of elementalism is about reminding people that this is a delusion. This idea of materialism is in fact a delusion and is not the true nature of reality. Therefore, there's no reason to despair about the death of your physical body. Your physical body will die, but the true essence of yourself, which is consciousness, will remain. So elementalism is really a philosophy of joy to anybody who has been weighed down by the material world and by the frequency of the material world.
Mm-hmm. So after you had that experience of meeting consciousness, if you like, through that what would you call it, ritual or not
sacrament? I'd say sacrament because psilocybin mushrooms are a sacrament that have been used by Indo-European people going all the way back to ancient Greece. Like the Eleusinian mysteries, which Plato also wrote about, were the major occasion on which these were used.
Right. So you had this huge transformative experience and you met consciousness. And out of that experience, is that how you started formulating the ideas for your book, Elementalism?
It was mostly through this psilocybin experience, yes. Psilocybin is a psychedelic, and psychedelic means soul revealing. In other words, it's something that is supposed to reveal a person's soul to themselves. And that was certainly true for me because I didn't believe in souls at the time when I was 27, took mushrooms for the first time. I didn't believe in souls. I thought the physical body was pretty much all there was. I was basically a Satanist, right? And the mushrooms made me realize that consciousness is the same thing as the soul, and that this is eternal, and that I finally understood the truths that are spoken about in the Bhagavad Gita, for example. Chapter 2, they talk about how the soul is eternal and consciousness is eternal, awareness is eternal, and I didn't understand any of that until I took magic mushrooms. But when I did, I realized that this information and these insights were not really applicable, not really amenable to the modern Western understanding, because we are so completely mired in materialism and consumerism and consumerist fashion that we've lost touch with this inherent spirituality almost totally. So elementalism was intended to fill that particular gap that I observed in the West, and hopefully overcome what Nietzsche was talking about, his fear of great nihilism and despair. Elementalism is intended to give people a reason to live again, a reason to a higher reason, and therefore is intended to make it so that people can overcome their baser and more bestial instincts. So it's a higher philosophy aiming at making things better for all of us.
Mm-hmm. So when you went to write the book, where did you get the material for the book? Did you research it? Where did it come from?
A lot of it came from ancient texts, like the Great Masculine Axis, for example. The concept of the Great Masculine Axis. This is something that Plato spoke about in the Republic. He used what he called the parable of the metals. It's known as the parable of the metals, where you have a person will start out in a lower and base kind of metal like lead, and then they eventually rise up towards iron and bronze and silver, and if they really do well, they can purify their soul to the level of gold, which is a high frequency. And of course, in for example, both Hindu and Greek philosophy, you've got the great feminine axis, which is the division of the material world into its constituent elements, which in this philosophy was fire, air, earth, and water. And so these constitute the feminine axis because all of the elements along this axis have equal value, although they're different form. So it's from these basic concepts from Greek and Hindu philosophy that elementalism takes its own basic concepts.
Gosh, that's fascinating. So did you marry those two ideas, that Western idea of the masculine axis with the Eastern idea of the feminine axis?
I did, yes. And that's why you can see in the holy emblem of elementalism, which is the quadrigetu, you can see that there's a masculine axis there leading from the white at the top to the black at the bottom, and that contrasts with the feminine axis, which can be seen, which moves from the red on the right-hand side to the blue on the left-hand side.
It's fascinating to me that you have this concept of the ascension of the one axis from, with, as you said, with the metaphor of the metals. You have this ascension up the one axis, but then you have the balancing of the other axis. It's a very complex concept that you have there in that emblem.
It is, and the beauty of it is that it describes the entirety of reality, because reality is both a material and a spiritual phenomenon. Although that's hard to conceptualize with a single emblem if you're thinking only in materialist terms. But the beauty of the quadrigetu is that it exemplifies how reality is both a physical and a spiritual phenomenon for those of us who are actually living in it.
Yes, right. Okay, so we're not going to get too far into that. I still have some questions that I need to ask you before we get too deep. So,
Right.
I've asked you what inspired elementalism, right? Who is elementalism for?
Really, it's for the people who have been caught by what I called the Clown World Fork in a previous book of mine, Clown World Chronicles, which itself is a concept relating to what Cyril Scott wrote about in his 1935 book, An Outline of Modern Occultism. He wrote about the fact that if you're an intelligent person, then you are not really going to believe in either of the two major narratives which you're given, one of which is your mainstream normie religious narrative. In the West, it's usually Christianity, and the alternative is the scientific materialist narrative, which says that you've got no soul and the extinction of the physical body is the end of consciousness, and we're all going to die and life's meaningless. And he wrote in 1935, he said that if you're a really intelligent person, then you're going to find that neither of those two narratives are actually fulfilling and convincing. So you are the sort of person who's going to look to the occult. So elementalism is really, it's written for the sort of person who would have been an occultist in previous times. In recent decades, people have been so hypnotized by the television that they haven't really had much of an appetite for occultism. But I believe that in the future this is going to return. I believe in a future occult revival, and elementalism is intended to be a part of that by summarizing, drawing together and summarizing neatly in one philosophy all of the esoteric truths from both the Western and the Eastern traditions. So this is inspired not only by the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition, which has its own origins in Egypt, of course, but also by Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucianism, and all of the Eastern traditions which sought to teach that there's more to reality than just the physical.
Okay. So you said just now that you had been sort of basically a Satanist, but then you met your soul and you met consciousness and you understood about eternal existence. But now you're talking about occultism. Now, I thought that Satanism and occultism were the same thing, but it doesn't seem that you're saying that they are.
No, they're certainly not the same thing. Although Satanism is a form of occultism, it doesn't mean that all occultism is Satanism. There are forms of occultism that are totally opposed to Satanism. Luciferianism, for example, is opposed to the egotistic and more brutal aspects of Satanism. But it believes that the Luciferian belief is that God is within still, which is something that elementalism shares, because the belief, of course, in elementalism, the first tenet, of course, is that consciousness is the prima materia. So the idea is that God is within all of us, and the aspect of God that is within all of us is the same as consciousness, the same as our consciousness, which is a fragment of God itself. So that shares the common New Age beliefs, the other New Age philosophies that you might hear, that we're all an aspect of the divine, which contrasts with the various other religious philosophies that emphasize how we're all less than the priest that's giving you the story. So elementalism is more of an uplifting philosophy than some of the ones that have come before.
Okay, awesome. So what then are the fundamental beliefs? You say that consciousness is the prima materia. What other fundamental beliefs make up the religion?
There are 4 basic tenets to elementalism, and these are similar to the 4 basic tenets of Buddhism in the sense that they're intended to describe the nature of reality to the acolyte. The first one, of course, as mentioned already previously, is that consciousness is the prima materia. In other words, that consciousness is the original fount of all being from which everything else is derived, including the entire physical world. So consciousness is prior to space and time, it's prior to creation, therefore does not need to be created, therefore it does not need to be manifested, it's already manifest, it's eternally manifest, and it's inevitably manifest. And that's the first thing that elementalism has to teach, because if you don't understand that first tenet, that consciousness is the prima materia, and that's what you fundamentally are, and that you're fundamentally dreaming up this experience of having a body, you are not actually the body itself, and your body does not produce consciousness, but rather consciousness produces the body. If you don't understand that, then you cannot have a spiritual foundation. So that's why that's the first tenet. The second tenet is that the conceivable universe, everything that you can possibly conceive of, is divided into consciousness and the great fractal being all of the possible contents of consciousness. And that leads on to the third tenet, which says that the great fractal is the eternal and infinite interplay of the war between good and evil and the dance between masculine and feminine. And this third tenet is amplified in the quadraditu. The war between good and evil is the same as the masculine axis. You see the white and the black. That's the good and the evil that fights with each other. And the feminine axis is the dance between masculine and feminine. You see the masculine is the red and the feminine is the blue. And these just naturally swap sides without having to fight over it. So you see the great fractal, therefore, is the eternal and infinite interplay of these two forces, the battle between good and evil and the dance between masculine and feminine. Now, the fourth tenet, which follows from the third tenet, is that the natural state of consciousness is of perfect bliss, and only by willfully forgetting this does consciousness ever come to suffer. And this is also known as the good news of elementalism, because basically what it says is that this material world and all of the suffering inherent to it, all of the misery, all of the suffering, all the pain, is just a dream, and that it's only a temporary thing, and therefore it's not something that one ought to be fundamentally horrified by or afraid of. That this experience of life is essentially okay, it's essentially a good thing, and so basically you entertain the gods more by enjoying it, and that's the fundamental moral philosophy of elementalism. Those are the basic 4 tenets. But the basic moral philosophy is that the meaning of life is to entertain the gods. So if you can entertain the gods by overcoming the suffering inherent to the material world, then basically you win. And you have merit in the eyes of the elementalist.
Mm-hmm. So when you say that consciousness is the prima materia, in a way, you're saying that consciousness is God? It's something that exists.
That's correct.
There, right. So we don't generate consciousness.
No, consciousness does not need to be generated because it's fundamental. It's more fundamental than all of generation. There's a chapter about this in Elementalism, in Elementalism, the book. There's a chapter about this, which is called The Triune Nature of God. And what that essentially, the chapter says, is that God is not only consciousness, but God is also you, and you're also God, and you're also consciousness. So those 3 things are basically, they're all the same thing. What you fundamentally are is consciousness, and it's the same thing as God. And that's called the triune nature of the real God.
Mm-hmm. So I would then guess that consciousness is outside of time?
It's more that time is inside consciousness. So it's like consciousness does not naturally feel the passing of time, which is why if you take a psychedelic, you can often feel like you've stepped outside the flow of time. You can feel timeless. But that's actually the natural state of consciousness, is not to experience time. The passage of time is actually an illusion that has been caused by the movement of consciousness through the great fractal. Now, I can explain this. If you look at television, for example, the brain thinks that what's happening on the television is a moving picture. If you watch the sport, if you watch the Springboks All Blacks game, then you think it's a moving picture. But what it actually is 25 still frames every second being moved past your eyes very fast. And that creates the illusion of a moving image. Now, in elementalism, it's understood that time is fundamentally the same. There is no such thing, but there is an illusion of time created by your fragment of consciousness moving through the great fractal. So that sort of thing requires quite a considerable shift in worldview from the person who's brought up in the average materialist environment.
Mm. It's fascinating to me. It's very similar to the Buddhist idea, as I understand it. The Buddhist idea believes that the consciousness is made up of a series of tiny, tiny little events called dharmas, which arise and fade away and arise and fade away, and that there is no continuity. Fascinating.
Yeah, elementalism is definitely friendly to Buddhism, but it takes more inspiration from the Hindu idea. That the Hindu idea is that essentially God got bored. God is called Brahman in Hindi. God got bored and dreamed up the world because the suffering of the world was actually less painful than the boredom of just constantly being in a state of bliss. And that belief is shared by elementalism.
That's a very interesting belief to me. It's very interesting and very challenging. That I would like to think that bliss is blissful.
Right. Yeah. No. It is challenging to believe that the natural state of consciousness is bliss. But if you've ever had such a powerful psychedelic experience that your physical body and your consciousness have entirely separated, then it becomes apparent that it's the physical body itself that is the fount of all the suffering. It's the needs and desires and dissatisfaction of the physical body that creates the suffering within consciousness.
You know, Vince, when I was at school, we were taught that atoms were made up of tiny little particles, and that electrons and protons and neutrons were like little marbles, you know, but just tiny. And then after I'd left school and I thought that I knew everything, they discovered that they weren't little solid particles at all. They were just little clumps of energy that were so small. And so it seems to me like I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about atoms and reality and everything, and I'm thinking like, it kind of makes sense that if consciousness was this great energy and it took itself and made atoms out of itself, that the particles would be tiny little clumps of energy. So it's almost that what you're saying
that's basically
with science.
Well, what I'm saying accords with the science of, for example, quantum mechanics, which states that the physical reality doesn't actually exist until it's observed, which is very similar to what elementalism says about the physical reality, which is that the great fractal, of course, just can always exist, but your personal fragment of consciousness doesn't experience it until the moment where it's actually observing that part of the great fractal.
So my personal consciousness believes it's in a body, but once my body is gone, my consciousness will then reunite with this big consciousness. Is that true?
That's a possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Elementalism doesn't really have it's totally firm ideas about the specifics of that, other than you basically get what you deserve. And this is known as the law of assortative reincarnation. Now, when your physical body dies, all that is going to mean is that your consciousness, which is the fundamental you, stops being aware of that physical body. because it starts being aware of the entire part of the great fractal in which that body incarnated. So that's going to include the entire world. So you're going to have consciousness, your fragment of consciousness is going to be separated from all of that physical world, and it's going to be in a state of non-awareness like it was before this life. And then it's going to manifest in another part of the great fractal, become aware of some other environment, and that environment is going to depend on the frequency of your consciousness, because your consciousness came into this, it incarnated into this world on a particular frequency, and depending on your behaviors whilst incarnated into this world, the frequency will change. So if you change it to a higher frequency, you will incarnate in a higher world, and if you change it to a lower frequency, you incarnate in a lower world. So basically you get what you deserve, but the specifics of it are worked out by the frequency of your consciousness, which is altered by the frequency of the actions that you make while in this material world. So it's another way of saying that karma is real, but it's a more specific way of explaining how karma could possibly manifest.
Okay. All right. So you've talked quite a bit about the great fractal, and you say that the second tenet is that all of creation is divided into consciousness and the great fractal.
That's correct.
Consciousness, how did consciousness create? Well, first of all, what is the great fractal?
The great fractal is everything that consciousness can ever possibly perceive of, which is another way of saying that it's every possible set of perceptions. For example, right now, my set of perceptions is mostly this laptop in front of me, microphone, camera I'm speaking into, but also in the periphery, I'm perceiving other things in the room that I'm in. That's my current contents of consciousness. Now, that contents of consciousness can change if I would move through the great fractal. It's already been observed that this physical world is one great fractal. You can see that if you stand on the beach by somewhere like Kaikoura, and you see the shape of the rocks is obviously a fractal, but elementalism believes that the entire universe is one great fractal, and not only that, but every possible universe that could ever possibly exist is part of this one great fractal, which is all connected in one self-same matrix of perceptions. So consciousness, your fragment of consciousness, can move from one world to another simply by moving from one part of the great fractal to another. So currently you're perceiving the perceptions that are associated with planet Earth, the planet Earth story. But upon the death of your physical body, these sensations may cease and you may become aware of an entirely different world. There could be a heaven, there could be a hell, there could be Earth all over again, could be a higher planet, could be the real Earth. I mean, I heard a philosophy the other day that this planet is actually called Vordak. It's not actually a real planet, and it's an imitation of the real Earth, which you can reincarnate to if you're lucky. I suppose that's quite similar to the old Greek beliefs about how you can incarnate into the Abyssinian fields if you've lived a heroic life.
Wow, how interesting. Gosh, that's so interesting. So
within the great fractal, there's everything possible, including all heavens, including all hells. Every time, and this is an essential part of elementalism, is the philosophy that when you are asleep at night and you're dreaming of being in another place, that place you're in is actually part of the great fractal, and your consciousness is perceiving it in exactly the same manner as you perceive this planet Earth, this material world. And that's hard for a lot of people to get their heads around. But if you understand that consciousness is the premier materia and that everything else is simply the contents of consciousness, then it follows naturally that the Earth world and the dream world are actually basically the same stuff.
So when you're unconscious in your body, your conscious is somewhere else. And
consciousness is where it always is, but if you're unconscious, what that actually means is that your body's capacity for forming memories has been disabled. For example, if you drink too much alcohol, that doesn't actually make you unconscious because consciousness is always there, but what it means is that your brain can be so disabled that at some point you're not going to be able to remember what it was that you were conscious of. So that's really more of a brain thing. That's what people don't understand. It's the same thing with anesthesia. If you disable the brain, then you also disable the memory encoding process, and that means you can't remember what you were conscious of. So it but essentially just disappears. Like because there's no such thing as time. If you are not conscious of a brain that has a memory, then you cannot have memory. So it's interesting.
So our brain can have thoughts, but the thoughts are not consciousness. The thoughts are manipulating consciousness.
The thoughts are the contents of consciousness. So consciousness is more pure than any of the possible contents of consciousness. So consciousness is more fundamental than all thoughts, all feelings, all sensations, and all perceptions. Consciousness is underneath all of those. So there is, of course, an interplay between consciousness and all of those things operating in the brain, but those are all secondary to consciousness itself, which has essentially dreamed up all of those feelings and thoughts and sensations and perceptions in order to entertain itself, which is the fundamental moral philosophy behind elementalism. In other words, the ontology, why God created the world in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so when you talk about the second tenet and you talk about how consciousness created the great fractal, you talk about consciousness forgetting itself. Am I right?
That's right. Consciousness in its natural state has all of the same attributes attributed to God. So it's omniscient, it's omnipotent, and it's omnipresent. It's aware of all possible things. But because of that, there's no distinction between the state of all-knowing and anything else. In other words, it becomes boring to know everything all the time. So in order to entertain God's self, God must split God's self up into all of these different fragments, which are not aware of the totality of the great fractal, the totality of consciousness. So basically, we incarnate in a state of ignorance, specifically because that ignorance entertains the gods. Our struggle to return back to a state of knowledge, an example of things like this show, we're recording this show because we are trying to struggle back to our initial state of gnosis, our initial state of knowing. Plato believed that all learning was in fact just remembering, and that in its natural state, the soul contained all knowledge. Now, this is a belief that's also in elementalism. It's belief that consciousness contains all knowledge. It's conscious of all aspects of the great fractal, but when a fragment of it incarnates into a physical body, it forgets all of those things and can only remember what it is that it can sense or perceive or think of or feel through the physical body itself. And then, of course, this experience ends. Like Bill Hicks used to say, this really is just a ride, and it ends. So you might as well enjoy it, because the human experience, it is going to end, and you incarnate as something else.
So it's valuable because it's rare. You've got these amount of years, and then they're done. You might do something else, but in this form, this is all you've got. Wow. In this form, this is all you've got. The meaning of life, of course, is to entertain the gods. So you've got to struggle. Like, you can't just surrender to the fact that you're going to die. You can't just say this physical form is eventually going to die, and therefore I'm just going to surrender to hunger or exposure or whatever. You entertain the gods by struggling. And that's primarily why this world is a world of struggle, because it's impossible to incarnate into this world and to not struggle, because you have to struggle just to stay alive. And that struggle entertains the gods, who, in elementalist philosophy, observe us from a higher dimension, like you would observe characters in a play or a video game. Excuse me, my cat. He found the conversation fascinating, and he had to come and join in. So, when you first described the entertaining the gods to me, I found it very I couldn't get my head around the idea that it would entertain the gods to see us suffering. That seemed very sick to me. But I think that you explained to me that it wasn't that they wanted to see us suffering, more that they wanted to see us transcend suffering. Am I right?
That's right. It's more like the suffering is an opportunity to overcome that suffering, and that's why it exists. Therefore, it's more that the suffering is necessary rather than it's something that's desired for its own ends. What's desired for its own ends is entertainment, and it just happens that overcoming the suffering is awesome entertainment. Like if you read a book of literature, it's never about somebody who has a really easy life the entire time. Inevitably, if you read a heroic story, it's about somebody who may have initially had an easy life, but then who has been thrown into conflict and chaos and discord and danger and adventure, and then who, from that state of chaos, returns to their initial state of bliss through heroic action or wisdom or whatever abilities, special powers. So that's your basic idea of a heroic story. And the elementalist philosophy is that our lives have been dreamed up by the gods, following the same pattern. That we start off in our initial state of bliss as per the fourth tenet of elementalism, and then we're cast down into this material world, into a state of ignorance and misery again, and then the gods see, can we overcome this, or do we succumb to it, or do we make other people's lives worse? What do we do? It's fascinating to watch on and to just observe the human drama, and it's believed that for that reason it exists.
Yes. All right, so that's the second tenet, is the great fractal. The third tenet is this interplay between masculinity and femininity and good and evil. And you say that masculinity and femininity dance together in a consensual relationship, whereas evil and good fight each other and oppose each other in a non-consensual relationship. That's fascinating to me.
Yep. No, it's fascinating, and it's the basis of all change. Like if you think about the changing phenomena that you're conscious of, they all follow one of these two patterns. Either it's good and evil fighting it out, or it's like the seasons where it's just masculine and feminine. And these ideas, it's important to understand in elementalism that these ideas are orthogonal, and that's the reason why there's a masculine axis and there's a feminine axis, because in elementalism, good and evil have got nothing to do with either masculine or feminine. They're entirely unrelated. That's why elementalism contrasts with a philosophy like Abrahamism, for example, where God is masculine, God is a he, and the material world is a she, which is cast under in terms of value. The feminine is less value in Abrahamism. That's why women can't be priests. That's why the Christian Bible says in the book of Timothy that women aren't allowed to correct men. They have to be silent. And that's why there are there's never been a female pope, for example, because in Abrahamic beliefs, women are subordinate. And in elementalism, like Confucianism, it says women have a separate role, and that's why there's a feminine axis where the feminine is on one side, it's the opposite to the masculine, so they're not the same thing. But on the other hand, neither of them are more good or evil than the other. And that's, if you look at Confucianism and Taoism, for example, and you look at the Taijitu, it's possible for some people to easily confuse good and evil with masculine or feminine. So that's why there's a quadrajitu in elementalism, which makes that distinction more explicit.
Okay. We live in clown world. We've spoken about that many times on our other shows. And one of the maybe characteristics of clown world is that people have lost the distinction between masculinity and femininity. And we have this very bizarre crossover that's causing a lot of huge anxiety and distress to parents, to a lot of different. What do you think is like why is that happening? What has happened to this axis? What's happened in our world?
Well, what happens when you conflate good with either masculine or feminine is that rather than behaving as their specific gender is supposed to behave, then the other gender will try and behave like the good. So once you start saying that masculine is good because God is good, and the feminine is bad because feminine is Satan in the material world, then you have women and girls will try and behave in a more masculine manner, and that's why you've got so many women who try and make a career. They think they're going to be judged by their success as a career woman, and this is all because they've conflated the masculine with the good, and they're trying to be masculine. But elementalism says the feminine is entirely fine as it is. It's different to the masculine, but it's got nothing to do with good or evil. So the feminine is left to be feminine, and the masculine can be masculine. Now, the ideas of masculinity and femininity in elementalism are mostly taken from Confucianism, which identifies the masculine with the yang, in other words, with the solar energies, with the light, and with extrusion and going out, and it identifies femininity with the yin, which is to say the lunar energies and darkness and going within and pulling within. But nothing about that has anything to do with good or evil. Like people usually say that, well, the light is good, but if you're out in the heat, you understand this being from Africa. If you're out in the heat and you're getting sunstroke, then you need to go into the shade, and that means the darkness is good. The yin energy is good. The same way if you burn yourself in hot water, you need to put cold water on yourself. It means the yin energy is good. The darkness is good. So the good and evil are broken apart from masculine and feminine. And that means that there's no obligation for women to try and act like men, and there's no obligation for men to try and act like women, which you also see in the modern school system, because most teachers are women. Something like 80% of teachers are women now. And that's normalized certain feminine ways of thinking. So you've got a lot of young boys going through the school system who are trying to act like women, in the sense that they're trying to be as agreeable as possible. And it doesn't really work, at least not for everybody. So elementalism is about people being able to find their own niche on the great feminine axis. Wherever it is, you're not judged for it, but it's best to find where you accurately are, whether you're on the feminine side or the masculine side. Perhaps you can be towards the middle, perhaps towards the edges. It doesn't really matter as long as you know what you are.
Well, Jung says that women start off being feminine, and they completely explore the whole world of relationship, nurturance, home, and they get to 45 or 50 and they're totally bored with it. So then they swap over and they explore masculine things like going out, getting a job, doing stuff. Whereas men start off by conquering and achieving, and then get to 45 or 50 and like, okay, we've done all that, now what? And then they explore relationships and grandchildren and that. So that concept has come into modern psychiatry. So there's obviously some fundamental truth, even though these, I mean, you talk about these being very ancient concepts, but they're part of Western psychological thought as well. So there's some.
Well, Jung was aware of the Western Hermetic tradition, so he would have been aware of something like, for example, the Taijitu, which the Taijitu, otherwise known as the Yin Yang symbol. If you look at the Taijitu, you can see it's shown very clearly that once you have too much masculinity, it naturally and inevitably transforms into femininity. And the reverse is true. Once you have too much femininity, the demand for masculinity is so high that masculinity comes into the system. And this is a great circle. This circle goes round and round. The yang energy goes into the yin energy, and the yin energy attracts the yang energy. And this is the nature of things. This is the nature of the changing of forms. And this will always be the case. The beauty of the Quadrijitu is that the same knowledge contained within it is applicable to any dimension that you can possibly incarnate into after this life. You will still have a good and evil axis in the next world, and you'll still have a masculine and feminine axis in the next world. So the Quadrijitu emblemizes both of those concepts.
Okay, now talk to me a little bit about good and evil, because this masculinity and femininity, we can see that this sort of, I can see that whole balancey thing happening. But with good and evil, there is the non-consensual, there's the line. There are some places in the world you just don't want to go. There are some things that are terribly destructive that we do need to stay away from. Is that part of that axis?
Well, in elementalism, it's believed that the major aspiration of life is to entertain the gods. Therefore, it doesn't actually matter what else the specifics of the action that might be taken. However, it says that the gods are not entertained by submission to baser instincts. So if you have an animalistic instinct to, for example, eat hamburgers all day, just get really fat, that is considered evil because it bores the gods. The gods are bored to see human beings simply submit to their base instincts like animals. They might as well watch animals then. Gods are bored to watch men molest children because you can see animals do the same thing. So you might as well just watch the natural world. What the gods want to see in human beings is heroism and the overcoming of great challenges. Like the archetypal example in elementalism is the conquest of Alexander, and that's why Alexander is a god in elementalism, and that's written about in one of the chapters near the end of the book. But what Alexander did entertain the gods more than anything else that's happened before or since, and so that's why Alexander is the typical example. Now I know that as per the line in Fight Club, if you want to make an omelette, you've got to break some eggs. So it's certain that what Alexander did, he would have done some evil things, like what we'd conventionally consider evil in the sense that they cause suffering to other people. But in elementalism, it's understood that if it entertains the gods, then basically everything's permissible.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So we are really, really important then. We human beings are something special to the gods, something much more.
We have the greatest opportunity to entertain the gods because we have the greatest scale. Like if you take animals, for example, animals can be entertaining for sure, but they only have a certain amount of complexity in their lives, whereas human beings can build empires, for example, and that's something else. That's something you don't see in, for example, cats or dogs or horses. They don't build empires that span continents. Right. So the operation of the human being allows for possibilities of entertainment that don't exist in other animals. But it's noted that there are other animals because in elementalism there is a hierarchy of animals, and humans are about in the middle of it. We're not at the top. So in elementalism, it's believed, for example, that noble animals like cats and birds and horses are higher than humans, even though they may entertain the gods less, and certain other animals like pigs and dogs and some other things are not so high.
Gosh, I find
but that's yeah.
It's like, there's not a lot of, we were just speaking earlier, we were saying how boring so much stuff that you see on TV is. But stuff like this is really inspiring when it calls on you to be more. It's quite.
Well, that's right. I mean, people are bored by materialism. That's why the cycle. You see, things all go in a cycle. Materialism is actually just part of the cycle, and people fall into materialism when the previous religious traditions told too many lies, and that's why we're in the state we are now. In the West, it was mostly Christians, and a lot of these priests. What happened was the priest said we had to go fight in World War I for king and God and country and all this, and then once people were there, they realised that this is not what should be happening, and so they lost a lot of faith.
Right.
That's really the origin of mass atheism in the Western world is World War I. But as it happens, that's not satisfactory. Atheism does not satisfy. Atheism does not provide any happiness. It's just a kind of anesthetized limbo. Mm-hmm. It's like being on opiates. It's not really reality. And so people aren't satisfied with it. And so you see now that people are searching for new spiritual and philosophical narratives. They're looking for something like elementalism, which is, of course, intended to fill a gap. I mean, elementalism has always, from the beginning, been intended to fill a need for the spiritual searching and to provide the spiritual truth in a way that's compatible with the modern Western mind, which is, of course, massively materialist.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Vince, we're coming to the end of the time, and I need to ask you these last few questions. So let me back my list. Right. What would it be like to become an elementalist?
To become an elementalist is to become liberated from all of the atheism and all of the nihilism and all of the humiliation of following doctrines that don't spiritually satisfy on the deepest level. If you're an elementalist, you understand that the reason for all of this is to entertain the gods, and therefore everything makes sense. The struggle makes sense, the personal struggle makes sense, because you're expected to die. As a mortal being, we're all mortals, of course, in this material world, so we're all expected to die, and therefore it's our struggle to overcome that inevitable death that entertains the gods. So if you become an elementalist, then life has a lot more meaning than if you're a materialist. If you're a materialist, you just believe that you're only just treading water, essentially, until your physical body expires, and then that's the end of everything. And there's no karma, there's no reincarnation, that's the end of the entire story. And that is not only a really depressing and nihilistic narrative, but it's also untrue. It's simply untrue. And that's something that we're going to talk more at length about that, I propose, in future editions of this show. Talk about specifically about how materialism is not a satisfying belief and does not lead to happiness. And elementalism is intended to be a solution to that problem.
Mm-hmm. Is it important, is it necessary, should I maybe say, for somebody to do psychedelic drugs in order to become an elementalist? Is that a rite of passage?
No, not at all. Not at all. You can become an elementalist just by simply believing the 4 tenets. That's the only thing that really matters. However, if you're going to become part of the elemental priesthood and start preaching, then you will have to do psychedelics with the other priests so that they can get a look at you and see that so that they can confirm that you're comfortable with your own soul. Right. And that can only really be known if you're willing to take a heavy dose of a psychedelic in the presence of the other priests. Mm-hmm. But as far as regular elementalists are concerned, just read the book. Just read Elementalism. That'll tell you everything you really need to know. It'll give you an entirely coherent and fulfilling philosophy of life.
And where is
the priesthood for a minority. The priesthood's for just the 1-2%, you know.
Yeah. Where is the book available, Vince?
Best place to buy it is on Amazon. I'll send you the link so you can put it in the description.
Okay, cool.
And just buy a copy of Amazon and post it out straight away. It's about $8 US, I think, on Amazon at the moment. So still fairly cheap.
Yes. Okay. And then you have other associated writings around these topics on your website, don't you?
Yeah, if you go to VJM Publishing, that's my initials, Vincent Jamie McLeod, publishing.nz, you'll see I've got a bunch of writings, not only about elementalism, but about associated spiritual topics, a lot of things that are ancillary to elementalism in the sense that they are tangentially related to the whole idea of trying to overcome the meaninglessness of life. So there's a bunch there that you can read. But the best thing is to get a copy of Elementalism itself. But do take note that it's not a book you can just blaze through in one sitting. It's very rich. And so it's the sort of book that is intended to be dipped into just one piece at a time.
Yes. All right. So we're going to be back next week, and we're going to be back with Julian Crawford. Would you like to give a little bit of an introduction to people who maybe have been here, been interested, would like to, know something more? What will we be speaking about next week, and who is Julian?
Julian is a fellow tripper. He's like me in the sense he's done a lot of psychedelics and that he's really interested in the world beyond the material. He's interested in all sorts of higher ideas like philosophy, psychology, politics, and so on. And he'll be talking with us on next week's show. The topic, we were going to talk about the cosmic joke and really how there is a cosmic joke. And if you don't know what it is, then the joke's on you. So we're going to talk about that next week and let people into the cosmic joke.
That's awesome. I'd like to know what the joke is. Okay, awesome. So we've done the book. We've done the website. Right. So the next thing to say is this time, 9 o'clock next Wednesday. We will be back here again. So thank you all very, very much for joining us. It's been fantastic. It's been so interesting for me. I hope it's been interesting for all of you. If you do have any questions that come up over the week, please remember, note them down somewhere, bring them with you, and see if you can catch us out. See if you can ask us something that we couldn't. I always find that interesting. Okay. And Vince, thank you so much. What a fascinating talk this has been. So good to be with you.
Cheers, Bob. Cheers, Bob. No, it's great talking to you, and it's great talking to the internet as well. I love sharing these ideas. And anybody who wants to know more about elementalism, please come by next week. Just ask a question here on the live chat. We'll answer it. Anything you want to know about the philosophy or the higher dimensions, Jules and I will have a go at answering that question.
Brilliant. Well, see you all then.
Cheers.